So welcome everyone to the Town of Richmond Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, October 16th, 2024. Welcome to our guests and to our planning commissioners, Chris and Mark, Ian, and myself. Allison is not here yet. She may be here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to first review the agenda and make sure that we are doing what we want to be doing tonight. So the agenda, other than the housekeeping items, has a single item on it, which is the public hearing on the flood hazard overlay district and associated amendments. So if any one of our guests is here to make a comment on something that is not on the agenda, this would be a good time to do it. Not seeing any hands or hearing any comments, we'll assume that our guests are here for the agenda item and we'll proceed with the agenda as published. Okay, then we're just going to quickly review the minutes of the 10/2/24 meeting.
Excuse me, Virginia. I'd like to bring up something in the public comment period.
As a member of the public?
As a planning commission member on an unrelated agenda item.
Okay, yep, go ahead, Mark.
I was just hoping that I could get a follow-up on the end of our last meeting and get some clearer explanation of the events that took place that regarding the walk around at the town park.
Mm-hmm.
And how I had been looped in on the original discussion with all the interested parties and the three parks, and as history, obviously, I've been on the rec committee for many years. I've been liaisoning with the three parks committee. I had expressed considerable interest in attending the meeting of the park walk around. And I was included, like I was saying, on the emails trying to coordinate that. And the last group email that went out was a discussion about how difficult it would be for members to attend. And then that was back in September. And then in the October 2nd meeting, nothing was discussed about that. And I brought it up at the very end of the meeting and asked when that walk around would occur. And you told me that it already had, which I found very frustrating, knowing that you knew my interest in attending. And I kind of lost focus after that. And now I'd kind of like to be able to understand a little better as to the decision-making process in that meeting and why I wasn't included in it.
Okay, Mark. Well, the short explanation is, and we can talk about it more at some point in time. The short answer is that meeting came up very suddenly. The point of it was for Tyler to explain his strategy for measuring the playground structures. So.
Right. I know that. That's why I wanted to be there.
Yeah. So
why wasn't I included? How did that email all of a sudden, including everybody, transition to something with a very limited number of participants, and then the meeting took place without any notification to me of any kind whatsoever?
Well, the meeting came together very suddenly because
Did you all get together for donuts and then, talk about it in the cafe and then walk over and do it? Was it that sudden, or was there an email exchange that set this up, an email exchange that I was excluded from?
It was set up for the following day because people were going to be away.
Right.
So
was that with an email discussion, though? That's what I'm trying to understand here, Virginia, is how is it that I was included on the discussion email group, And then when it actually came to having the meeting, I wasn't included on the email discussion group.
Okay, I apologize for not including you, Mark.
So that was initiated by you?
What?
This, the hasty meeting the next morning? Following I'm trying to figure out, I mean, there was a couple of emails after our last, meeting in September. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the meeting on October 2nd, I'm told it already occurred and the decisions were made.
Yep. So I think you were just accidentally left off the list, Mark.
Accidentally? How can that be accidentally be left off the list? I
You
don't
were
understand
left
that,
off the list.
knowing that you full well knew my interest in attending this meeting and my repeated attempts to coordinate with management. I haven't been able to speak with, I was told that I was not allowed to discuss flood hazard overlay district issues with Tyler last spring. I was told that by the town planner, with you copied on the email. And so since then, I've been interested in this topic and wanting to find out more about it and understanding the interpretations that have gone into the decision making that I've sort of heard about secondhand.
Yep. All I
And-
can tell you
and-
is that it
and-
was oversight and I am apologizing for the oversight of not notifying you of this meeting that was coming up.
Seems like there's a lot of oversights when it comes to my involvement with the planning commission. It just, this isn't like this is the first thing that's happened. I'm pretty concerned. But evidently that's the only answer you're going to give me, and an extremely undefined memo that you sent out in an email, which wasn't very
Which explains
descriptive at all.
what happened.
We'll see, we'll hold this hearing. And then maybe it'll give you some time to think about some of the questions that are gonna come up.
I think Tyler has a comment.
Yeah, so just two things. I mean, Mark, it could have been, because I was following up with it as well, and it did come up suddenly, and they asked, Virginia and a member from the committee asked to meet, and they asked if I could meet Friday, so I went down and I met with them. More than happy to go down with you personally and do it. That's not an issue. I don't have any problem doing that, and it could be quite simple as that somebody just forgot to reply all and just didn't send it to everybody. I've done that sometimes on big email chains. It may not have been anything necessarily.
That would be a reasonable excuse if it was accidental and then the reply all to just one person, but there was several people involved in the email group originally. So I appreciate your attempt at an excuse.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Tyler. I'm sure Mark will take you up on your offer.
I
Anytime.
tried to take him up on that offer this spring when the select board tasked us with moving forward on flood hazard overlay district rezoning and was told I couldn't talk with him. And now it's okay for me personally to contact him?
I've never turned down anybody who's.
No, you didn't. You didn't. It was in an email exchange that included Virginia and Keith. And I think you originally, where I was told I wasn't, I was wasting your time and that we needed to get together as a group and come up with the questions appropriate before we wasted any more of your time with questions regarding the flood hazard overlay district.
Well, I don't consider it a waste, so you have a standing invitation from me. You could set up as many meetings with me as you want, so.
Yeah. So, and I don't recall that incident that you're talking about.
You don't? I have the email you're copied on if you're interested.
Yeah.
Which wasn't an issue, but it just seems like this is just snowballing. There's that incident. There's a total delay of discussing this for 6 months. And then there's blowing me off at the walk around meeting. It's not an incident. symptom of a continuation of an issue. It's not just one off and an accidental overlook. And yes, I would like to talk about this further, but
Yes, we
give
can
me
talk
some
about,
time to collect your thoughts.
I think we're gonna move ahead with our meeting right now.
You do that.
So we're gonna look at the minutes of the 10/2/24 meeting. If anyone has any comments about that, this would be a good time to make them. Commissioners, any hands? No hands? Okay. So if there are no corrections or additions to the minutes, then we will accept them into the record as written. All right, let's get down all these folks who are here. Okay, so we'll move on to number 5, which is the public hearing on amendments to the flood hazard overlay district to allow relocation of pre-existing structures from one location in the floodway to another. So we're going to want to start with a motion from a planning commissioner to open this public hearing for amendments to the flood hazard overlay district, section 6.8, plus sections 4.7 and 4.8, and definitions, section 7. This was approved by the Planning Commission on 9/4. Do I have a motion to open that hearing?
I'll make a motion to open the hearing.
Okay. Is there a second? Ian makes a motion to open the public hearing. Is there a second?
So moved.
Chris? Are you seconding it?
I did.
Okay, you were muted for a minute, but. All right. So all in favor of opening the public hearing can say aye.
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 I,
And Mark, are you saying aye?
Aye.
Okay, so we've got 4 ayes. The public hearing is now open. Okay,
Where do you want
So-
to start?
I'm going to start with a little summary of what it is that we're trying to do here. This is on our webpage. I'll just read it basically. Since several structures in the Volunteers Green Park are located in the direct path of the Winooski River during a flood, this is called the floodway. The idea was to move these structures to a location within the park where they are less likely to be damaged by flooding, namely the plateau where the bandshell is currently located. And by the way, there were 2 assignments at the meeting that was held with various stakeholders. One was for Pete Goslin to look at creating a platform underground with a rubberized top at the current location to embed the posts in. The other was to move the structures to the plateau where the bandshell is. So those were the 2 kinds of ideas that were going to be worked on. I haven't really heard anything more about the platform underground. I don't know if Pete has been looking into that or not.
He's probably been busy, to be honest with you.
Yes, he's probably been very busy with the flooding. So anyway, and the structures mainly under consideration for moving were the playground structures and the building containing the restrooms, both of which have significant restoration needs after the floods. So to enable the relocation of these park features, the zoning regulations need to be amended because right now you can't move these structures around in the flood hazard area. So the flood hazard overlay district, the zoning that deals with this is a carefully crafted document that follows a Vermont template that has been created by the Environmental Commission, the Department of Environmental
Conservation.
Conservation to meet FEMA requirements and to meet the requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is necessary so that folks can get flood insurance in the town. And it's also a good idea to have a strong floodplain ordinance, because you don't want to be putting a lot of structures in the floodplain that are then going to hold the water back, cause it to go in other places. So the Planning Commission looked at a lot of different approaches to enabling these changes. And the best one appeared to be talking about the current structures that exist, pre-existing non-conforming structures. The reason they're called non-conforming is because they wouldn't be allowed to be built today in that location, but they're grandfathered essentially because they were built, we are assuming, before the regulations existed. So the idea was to identify the currently existing structures and then give them sort of special privileges, including relocating them, restoring them, reconstructing them, or replacing them on the same footprint so that there wasn't any increase in the hindrance to the water during a flood. So that was the main thrust of the work that we were doing. We also added a section to make it possible for very small structures like trash cans, picnic tables, poles, temporary tents and canopies to not need a permit. These are considered not to increase the flood hazard, slow the water, or be an impediment to the water, or they're temporary. These we have defined as incidental structures. The things that we haven't addressed yet, because they have come up kind of since we put this scheme together, were the question of a fence around the playground, which is going to be needed if there's going to be children next to the river, next to the road. It's going to be essential to have a fence. This is a new structure, which we're trying to avoid putting new structures, which will add to the flood hazard. So we're working on making a way to allow that. We have some potential language for that. And also to make the structures up on the plateau accessible, more accessible than they are currently, and accessible to a certain degree, possibly not ADA, fully ADA, because the terrain may not be such that that's actually possible. So as accessible as is feasible, given that we're not going to be adding fill and long sloping ramps and so forth. So anyway, that's the approach that we have taken. We are mindful that at this time in the history of climate change, we need to try to be as resilient as possible, not interfere with the function of the floodplain, and not spend any more money than we have to in putting in structures where they're going to be damaged and we're going to have to repair them. So that's a brief description of what we've got. The document itself, we can go through piece by piece if people wish to do that, or we can have comments. We'll start with opening up the floor to anyone who might have a comment. And then we can go to specific sections of the document if we wish to do that. So we'll open the floor for comments. Hands, I see, it looks like Bard. Yes.
Thanks so much for doing this, and I realize the amount of work it is taking and continues to take. So start with that. I really have a question rather than a comment. and I'm sorry not being a closer student of this, but in a quick skim of the document, I didn't see the issue of soccer goals. Are they considered structures, how we deal with that? And then the backstops, which are of course fixed. And maybe I just failed to find it in the document. Those two items, the backstops and the soccer goals, which are of course movable.
Yes, so they are going to be considered grandfathered. They exist, they're there. There's no way that we can move the soccer fields and the baseball diamonds. It would perhaps be possible to make backstops that are less restrictive to the water. And the idea with a fence around the playground, even though it will be in the plateau, which is less likely to be flooded, is to make it as easy for the water and the debris to get through as possible and still have it be functional. So that would be something that could be considered, is to replace those backstops with material that would allow the water and the debris to pass through more freely. The soccer goals are movable, as I understand them, that,
They're on wheels, I believe.
yeah, they're on wheels, so
They're still considered structures.
they're still considered structures. They could be moved presumably if, you know,
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and that's one thing to bear in mind, Bard, with all of this is that as they're written, at least right now, and I know this draft does make some attempts and does, I think, fix a lot of it, is it doesn't really envision something like Volunteers Green, right? It's really envisioning more of a kind of what we would call a traditional structure, right? Which is, 4 walls and a roof, something like that. It's not really envisioning soccer goals or a baseball diamond or playground equipment, which does meet the definition of structure, but isn't how we would commonly kind of think of it as, like, my example of 4 walls and a roof. So that's kind of like the challenge with some of this stuff is how do you classify it? What do you put it under? And by putting it into one category, what does or doesn't it not let you do? And that's what's made this whole process very, challenging from my standpoint, is to how can I permit stuff? Can I permit stuff? To what extent? That sort of stuff. That's really been the issue.
do you have any suggestions, Bard?
Well, maybe just this. I was thinking it might be worth actually having their presence somehow in the document, that you could find the word soccer goal, because, maybe 5 years from now, somebody reads it and goes, well, maybe soccer goals aren't allowed. So maybe it's just, is there some point of clarity so that a citizen or future citizen groups, when I or you are not here in these discussions, would say, oh, this is like the soccer goals are allowed or the backstops are allowed, and they could be replaced or repaired, but not, I guess, moved, or you can't make things worse. Maybe you can make things better. And frankly, as we were talking about this, one thought I had is some of the soccer goals have wheels. So is it a vehicle or is it a structure?
Yeah, and the other question is it an incidental structure under our definition of incidental structures, which could be
Yeah.
temporary structures of less than 150 square feet, which I would say a soccer goal is probably less than 150 square feet.
About that.
One
It's
soccer
in that
field.
neighborhood, depending on whether you just measure the part of the goal touching the ground or the envelope, the rectangle that represents the goal space within the soccer goal. I don't know what the right answer is.
My 2 cents is if these are pre-existing non-conforming structures, they're legal at this point in time, and they wouldn't be considered something that you couldn't move. You certainly couldn't move them based on the way we're promulgating this language. I don't know where it would end as far as what you'd want to put on that list, though. That's my concern, we also have to deal with the backstop that is with the ball fields. And, you know, that are in by the dugouts, all those fences. And you see those pictures. I know when Tyler and I went out last time, all the debris that was on that stuff was mind-boggling how high it was up there. It's pre-existing, legally non-conforming at this point. So, you know, the language as promulgated, as stated, can allow for movement of that if you wanted to reconfigure those fields. There's no structure with the fields themselves. I guess you would consider the base pads, maybe something along
It's-
that would be, but
Again, it's really complicated. I did kind of look at that idea as a way, at least initially, of a way of potentially expanding this stuff, because leaning into the fact that as written, our definition of structure, and paraphrasing a little bit, is an assemblage of material intended for occupancy or use.
so we're talking
it's
about a use.
very, very broad, and it's intended to be like, if there's any question as to whether or not something's a structure, it's a structure. If I
Yeah. it's
want to go
structure.
that route.
Yeah.
Now, what do you call, and gets to the other issue is, what is volunteers green, right? Right, what is it? And that's the part of the struggle has been with this, like, how do you define it, right? Do you define each individual little item, each individual little structure as its own thing, or is it part of a larger, a larger construct? And kind of what I've arrived at is that the entire volunteers green area is an outdoor recreation facility. Right, and that's defined in our regulations. So- Currently, right, so that's how I'm defining that area. Now, as a result of that, Bard, I wouldn't say that soccer goals or anything like that would be removed or wouldn't be conforming, because it's an outdoor recreation area. Now, you might not be able to add new soccer fields.
Correct.
Or new backstops, right? But what's there, the use of that area is an outdoor recreation, is a recreation facility. That's kind of what I've at least arrived at.
And they're pre-existing. It would be nice that the wrecked soccer goals could be removed at some point, because how many soccer goals do we need?
Well, I
There are
mean-
some that are sort of beyond
The
repair.
goals are honestly tricky, because ideally when I permit things is they don't move, right? When I issue a permit for a structure, it's for a specific thing in a specific place. Now, you could argue that the goals could be considered temporary structures
Mhm.
because they're up for less than 180 days, and you could pick them up and move them around, which
Have
might
wheels.
have wheels, which might make sense to look at it that way, which to be honest, I spent more of my time looking at the plateau,
Mhm.
not so much the soccer goals, but just a quick little peeky peek here.
Okay, while you're looking that up, Kara, you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you. I think one of the key things here, or a couple of key things that I want to bring to your attention. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, beautiful. Is that you need to define the municipal park. It's a park. Volunteers Green is a municipal park. It's not a recreational facility that is owned by anybody other than the town. So I think you could define municipal park, and then you could do what the state of Vermont staffer that attended the summit said. You could make changes that would be minimal changes to your regulations to allow for what the three parks committee's goal was to accomplish, that the select board agreed to, the parks committee agreed to, and the select board charged with the planning commission to make it happen. And it's not because the state regulations don't allow it. It's not because FEMA doesn't allow it. It's because the town of Richmond's regulations are more restrictive than the state of Vermont template and FEMA. So we could strictly stop skirting around this stuff, stop making Tyler have to interpret what a soccer goal is, and say municipal activities such as baseball, soccer, a playground, and other structures that are to mitigate flood risk may be allowed, period. Meaning replacing goalposts, moving goalposts, things like that may be allowed in a municipal park as long as it mitigates flood risk. That's a very simple thing to do, and we've overcomplicated this thing, and the overcomplication of this has made it more restrictive rather than less restrictive. And I am very concerned about issues like having things be, quote, more accessible, when that term is really almost to hide the fact that you're not willing to push to make things ADA accessible. And we are all mindful of climate change. We are all mindful of spending. But this was a task that the select board asked the planning commission to, quote, fix the regulations to allow the parks committee to do some of the things the select board wants to see or would like to see done, or the public would like to see done. Now, moving the playground from where it is up onto the plateau is common sense. The plateau does not have the flood waters, the speed of the flood waters that it does in the lower section. So I am very, very disappointed with the approach we are taking right now to not simplify, rather make it more complicated. And that's called bureaucracy. And we're not looking for that. I am the first person to fight to help mitigate flood risk. But this is not right in the way it's been done. And I'm not sure if some things are still added in there that got added in after the summit. Things like making sure the band shell's only replaced with a band shell, making sure that a paved path can't occur, all things that nobody asked for, but the planning commission built in. Now, I'm not sure if it's in this draft, because I think what Tyler needs to not have to interpret things, but clear direction is not being given. And the fact that we have to interpret what can be done with baseball or what can be done with soccer makes this more restrictive, more confusing, and not what the purpose of rewriting this section
Kara,
was.
can you please bring this to a point? I understand what you're trying to say, but this is rambling on a little bit. Can you please constrain your...
Great, Chris. I've been to everything. And the planning commission didn't do what they were tasked to do in a manner of which Tyler can interpret. Thank you.
Yeah, so
He
the
didn't have to
language
interpret
has
black
been
and white.
simply changed. The language has been changed in a fairly simple way. If you read the document, there have been some changes made that will allow for many of these things to be done. So I think Fran had the next hand.
Sure.
Yeah,
The first thing
you
was,
want to come
yep,
under
Fran, there's
the-
no mic there either now, so you might have to come up or move over to where Bob is, because there's a mic there.
This okay?
Yeah,
it should work.
you should.
Over your head. All right, so first, on the more mundane things, when you were talking about soccer goals and how they're included and not included.
Yeah.
There are other sports that have not maybe routinely been played down there, but what if Camel's Hump wants to come down and play field hockey or lacrosse? We don't want language there ought to be language general enough that allows for those kinds of movable things. Their goals are different than soccer goals. So when you were particularly mentioning, say, soccer goals and baseball backstops, you can't just stop at that. There has to be some sort of general language, I think, that allows for other similar like structures or items.
So that would be adding more structures. So the idea has been not to add a lot more structures. To the
No,
floodway,
but
into the floodway.
those would be temporary, but
Yeah,
if
so they would have to
Someone
come
want-
under the temporary structures. The
Yeah,
incidental.
I just don't want the language
structures.
to, if you start specifying soccer or baseball and not
Yes,
go
again.
far enough.
Yeah.
There ought to be some
So
sort
we
of,
haven't done that. We
a
haven't
general-
specified
is
soccer.
there a
and
general term
Some type of blanket term that
that
would.
allows those types of items?
baseball. Okay, so you're responding to Bard's
Yes.
comment.
Yeah.
about the- Mhm. Yeah.
I might as well talk about, the plateau and replacement, always saying it has to have the purpose of a band shell. and it's not necessary, I'm not speaking for the committee, I'm speaking for myself.
Mhm.
That I would hope that we can look at the platform area as a clean slate. We haven't gotten a report yet on the band shell, but and re-envision what's there and make the whole park more resilient than it is now. And so that if we were to remove the bathrooms down below, does that give us a little credit to do a little bit more up above? Because in the end result, we, when we're done, if we had a plan and that, you know, I might like to see, in the end, what we end up with up above is less deterrence to floodwaters than what we
Less
have
of a
now.
hazard, yes.
And so when we start talking about language being so specific about it having to look like a band shell, that I find somewhat limiting
Mhm.
to us to sort of re-envision what is up there. As long as we, in my mind, we don't get rid of, or we don't negate the fact of having music there, or, you know, up there, but maybe it's not in something called a band shell.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's really where my concern is, you know. What we can do is so tied to what is there, I'm not sure we're gonna end up with less flood resilient, you know, more flood resilient structures up there.
Mhm. And hopefully at your meeting, you guys meeting next week, you will be able to ascertain whether people want the band shell that currently exists, whether they feel it's an icon or whether they feel it's an eyesore, which we understand there's debate about. So,
Well, that's part of it, but also there is, what is it gonna cost to keep that band shell and make it safe and make it handicap accessible? And if we can, if that cost is enough such that we say we can do better by taking it down and building something more multi-purpose and it is less flood prone, I want us to have that ability to do that. I think that's really important. We've had an engineer now who is Denise and I met with, and we don't have his report yet, but
Hmm.
he was gonna, you know, do an analysis of the condition of the band shell.
and do you have any idea about what it would cost to take that away and to
No.
build something new? I mean, that's, if you want people to be able to compare costs, you're gonna have to tell them
Oh,
that
absolutely.
as
Yeah.
well, what
Yep.
that would cost.
And just like the restrooms that are down below, what is it gonna cost us if we want to get rid of those?
Right.
But if we get rid of those, we're getting rid of a lot of impediments to the floodwater.
Mhm.
So I'm hoping that by getting rid of those, maybe we have a little credit that we can use up
Mhm.
above on the plateau.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else here first? I think Bart, you had another comment, and then Mark, and then we'll go here.
I'll be really short. I think Fran makes good points. When I was mentioning the soccer goals and the backstops, I was mentioning them because I go there with some frequency and they are both there 12 months a year. So they are however we think of them. They're always there, although the soccer goals are moved around. But Fran raises a good point. I like the sort of rule of parsimony to say something simple. The backstops might be in a category unto themselves because they are fixed, but the other stuff, you know, different kinds of goals, cones, etc., that can be moved. Maybe there's a simple generic language that said, you know, nothing in these regulations prohibits that kind of recreational athletic activity, and the use of whatever term we come up to describe that inclusively. That would seem like an elegant solution.
Thank you. Mark, and then. Yeah,
Hey there. So first of all, I just want to clarify that, these regulations, there has not been a lot of planning commission discussion put into these regulations and the changes that were made. You know, we were tasked at the round table by the select board to come up with zoning regulations last winter, like March, was it, or something like that? We didn't talk about it again for 6 months. We've had maybe 2 meetings before we voted to move these regulations forward as is to a hearing. And they weren't 2 full meetings. Don't get me, they were partial meetings talking about floodplain. So there hasn't been a lot of debate among the planning commission about our options. I did take the liberty of speaking with Kyle Madash from the state representative for FEMA. And in like 5 minutes, he made it clear to me that all of the things that have been talked about by the 3 Parks Commission are perfectly viable and reasonable to do and well within FEMA zoning regulations. FEMA zoning regulations are primarily about reducing insurance costs, building costs, restructuring costs, and ultimately reducing downstream impact on activities. Although FEMA allows for fill and other things that would obviously reduce the volume of capacity of floodplains and push upstream. So FEMA allows these, okay? Just so we're all on the same page. The Richmond zoning regulations are extremely strict. And rather than taking a broad-minded approach to addressing the charge given to us by the select board, we basically went about trying to be as minimalistic as possible to the zoning regulations and making really like minuscule changes that are causing all of these complications with interpretation that that Tyler has repeatedly brought up and Kara highlighted earlier. Those confusions are because the zoning regulations still are extremely strict. And even with the zoning regulations, as we're talking about now, moving them forward, they are not going to be able to enable the things like improving putting in fencing, which isn't part of a previous structure. So you get this interpretation, oh, it's all being treated as a recreation area. Well, if it's all treated as a recreation area, then pretty much you can do anything recreation oriented within that without confining it. Then you hear the interpretation, oh, well, we can do that, but you can't add any more structures, even though it's part of a facility, which theoretically you could expand the size of, according to FEMA, and allow for larger capacity and be able to put in a fence and maybe even a slightly, an 8-foot slide instead of a 7-foot slide. Those are all things that FEMA doesn't have a problem with. Putting in a pavilion doesn't have a problem with. You got 6 poles. Putting in a walking path, FEMA doesn't have a problem with. Fencing to a degree can be an impact because it has it, but it's all about interpreting. But there's things that you could do to mitigate the impact of a fence or even another building by enabling flow through. There's absolutely nothing stopping us from putting in a bathroom up on the plateau and a full structure with or without the current rotunda, we could replace that, we could enlarge it, we could put in ADA, walking to that. All of that is well within the scope of what FEMA deems acceptable. It's just not what's within the scope of our current zoning regulations, our proposed zoning regulations that we're looking at tonight, and the interpretation of said regulations by the current town staff. So to Kara's point, there's absolutely nothing stopping us from simply segueing, cutting out a flood hazard overlay district out of the current one, maintaining the current zoning regulations, which are extremely strict and probably not the worst idea for the crazy people who try to get away with absolutely the worst ideas that could have an impact and a lot more land area, versus something that's controlled and overseen by a judiciary body such as the select board, making decisions about what can go in where and whether that really is a good idea or whether it's a bad idea,
Okay,
but
so
still legal. So
Mark, and I'm gonna go to the public now, since we have some people, members of the
excuse me,
public.
I'm still trying to make a point here, and I know you make a habit out of trying to not let me express my opinions on this commission. It's getting a little frustrating, I gotta say, Virginia. It's getting very frustrating. But my point is that even if we adopt these zoning regulations tonight, they're still not going to be able to be interpreted to make what the three parks envisions is okay, what the select board probably thinks is also okay, but is being interpreted as being too liberal for the current interpretation of our zoning regulations. So I guess my real point here is that I hope that the planning commission takes this meeting and endorses the zoning regulations as proposed so that they can come out of the planning commission's purview and into a more reasonable, what I imagine is a more reasonably bodied ownership of the select board, where they can then take a more critical look at the interpretation of these possibilities that have been ruled out and not even put forth to the planning commission as possibilities. So that I think I'll settle on for the time being. My feedback. I'd like to hear from the public too.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Bob, I think you were next.
Yes, Michael.
I think you're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Bob Heiser, I live on Esplanade, and I just wanted to say that I do think the changes to the zoning regulations in order to move structures up onto the knoll seems entirely consistent with the existing purposes of the floodplain overlay, including things like minimizing property loss, minimizing loss of public expenditure and impacts to floodplain function. So I just wanted to express that, and I appreciate the care that has been taken to not open the door to significant new structures in the floodway for environmental and flood risk reasons. I think it's important to not proliferate a lot of structures and impervious surfaces in the floodway. And I hope that in considering things like safety and accessibility additions around and attached to existing structures, that it can similarly be done in a way that is specific to those existing structures and serving those structures, and not in some way opening the door for a lot of new structures in the floodway. I think I know the answer to this question, but I just wanted to ask you just to explore it. It seemed like the levels on the knoll would be out of the floodway and I know the existing map has it mapped as floodway almost entirely. From the survey levels of, I can't remember the numbers, 310 feet or just under. Would it be possible to do a map amendment to remap the floodway? Or is that just too crazy of a process to entertain? If it would make the knoll more flexible is my notion.
I
But
can answer that.
Okay, Tyler.
So, that actually was looked at. So me and Pete had that conversation, and part of what came out at that roundtable was looking into exactly that idea, because logically you look at it. Well, this is significantly higher than the surrounding terrain, should be up above it, and actually the bridge and Gary's house are not only out of the floodway, they're out of the floodplain entirely, just because it's this little island essentially that's up out of it. The problem was when Chris Haggerty looked at it, it was still within the floodway. The band shell, the floor of the band shell was basically in the floodway.
And Chris Haggerty is who?
And Chris Haggerty is a engineer. So he looked at initially to see whether or not we had a shot at getting a LOMA. We don't allow LOMA Fs, which is LOMAs based on fill, and even if we did, they're generally not allowed in the floodway. Be more like kind of where your house is, where you could do something like that. So, and the problem with that is if you're in by an inch, you're in by a mile. You're in, and that's just kind of how that works. And also this also I think would help clear people up as to why maybe I interpret things kind of the way I do, and kind of in a very literal sense. Is section 8.1 of the zoning regulations, specifically page 111. Note that the administrative officer shall administer these zoning regulations literally and shall not have the power to permit any land development which is not in conformance with these zoning regulations. So what that's intended to do is to prevent me from essentially writing the zoning regulations myself, and me just saying, oh, because I have decreed that it is in compliance with the regulations, it is in compliance with the regulations. So, and much to, the public's frustration and my own oftentimes is does lend me to interpret things in a way of, this is what I think they mean, not necessarily what I would like to see them mean. So I do think that that's important to kind of to clarify that as well. So unfortunately, Bob, to your point, we did look at that initially, and had we been able to do that, then yeah, that would have made all the sense in the world.
there's one more follow-up question.
Yeah, go ahead.
The 6.8.16, which is the development standards or something like that, it looked like it was completely deleted and then replaced. I think it was just moved, and the track changes showed it being moved.
Mhm.
But there weren't changes in that addition that,
Correct.
okay, it's just
No.
moved.
Yeah,
There were
Yeah,
no
it's just flow.
changes, and we removed the pictures and put them all together in a
the
group
bottom,
because
yeah.
they kept interfering with the text. So
Thank you.
that's the red line. So, yeah, I think Denise, you were next, and then
John.
John.
Might be an engineer though, too.
Yeah.
Hi, Denise Barnard, member of the Three Parks Committee. And for clarification, Chris Haggerty was hired by the town and he's a surveyor. He may be an engineer as well, but I know he was a surveyor.
LOMA stuff.
Okay.
He's done those before.
Right, so he was very familiar. He was at the summit that evening. The second item that I wanted to talk about was, I just want to go on record once again to let you know that the Three Parks Committee voted unanimously not to go forward with any plans for a paved path, a crushed stone path, a walking path around Volunteers Green. So I just want to make sure that everyone out there knows that is not on our agenda. We are not even looking at it, at that again. We had talked about it. We had gotten information. We had gotten, estimates and quotes, but that is not something we are even going after, even looking for. So I just want to make sure that everyone knows that. The third thing I just wanted to talk about was, don't tie our hands. Please don't tie our hands. And when you have your document in front of you, all you keep talking about is a band shell. If, as Fran mentioned earlier, we've met with structural steel engineer, and he said it is unsafe. It is structurally unsafe. He is getting a letter to us, and that should be coming, I'm hoping this week. I may even make a phone call tomorrow. But he, he was gonna do more measurements and more tests after we left, Brandon and I left. And he was going back, but it is structurally unsafe. So when you put band shell in your document, you're tying our hands for any further research on any other structures. I.e. a structure, something that has a top on it with, you know, maybe concrete corners or 4x4s or whatever, or a pavilion, anything like that. You're tying our hands when you say band shell, because in my mind, when you say band shell, I know what a band shell is. And I think some people would know what it is, but are you limiting us that we can only do a band shell there? So I guess I'm asking you to change your verbiage and your definition and stop using the word band shell. And that's how I feel. And I'm talking on that part, I'm talking for Denise, I'm not talking for the committee, because it's nothing that we had talked about, except we kind of felt maybe our hands were a little tied when we start, because we're researching things now and, you know, getting prices. And so, thank you.
Yeah. So Denise, just to clarify, so a band shell is a structure with a sound wall. So the thought was, if we care about the musical function, and I'm hoping that you all will find this out when you have your meeting, what importance people attach to the
Mhm.
sound reflecting component of a band shell.
Right.
It is possible for us to define that structure differently.
Okay,
It's possible if we get enough enthusiasm for something that isn't, you know, what that band shell was designed for, which
Right.
is to be a good musical
Right.
space, to call it a park structure that can host events,
performance
and
area.
performances
Yeah.
and musical event, you know. So we just want to understand what the appetite is for that. Right now, since the basis of moving the playground structures is writing an ordinance that allows for the movement of existing structures, the band shell is an existing structure as it is, so it can be moved. You could move it if you wanted to. You wouldn't want to move it down lower because that would be increasing the flood hazard. Or you could reorient it, or you could rebuild it, you can remake it. So theoretically, it's possible that we could define it differently, not as a band shell, but as a park structure that hosts events or
Perfect.
something
Thank
like
you so much.
that.
That would be great.
So, you know, but we're gonna see.
Right.
This is
Exactly.
this is an outreach kind of thing. We're taking input from various people and, you guys will be taking input too at your meeting,
Exactly.
and we'll see. So I think that's possibility. Yeah. Tyler,
So
you had
just-
something?
yeah, to that
And then
point.
John.
To that point, I think this is what catches that up is like, why is Tyler, you know, why am I hung up on a bandstand? Is that really what it kind
Well,
of
it's not a bandstand
Well,
either.
Oh,
It's a band shell.
Well, the point is that it's regardless of what it is, it's all right now considered legally non-conforming. So what the issue is with that is legally non-conforming stuff is that while it may make logical sense, like, well, you know, why can't you just take the square footage or whatever and switch it to change it from a band shell to a pavilion or something else? The short answer is that none of that should be down there in the first place, which is what makes it very hard to be able to change it. And if you look at 6.815 letter E, which does in this draft give the DRB the ability to relocate or reduce the size of a non-conforming structure, it's still gonna be, what's still gonna hang you up in terms of changing the uses is a section, it's about the third sentence in, it says, or of a structure containing existing non-conforming use. So because the band shell is already existing, there isn't a pavilion existing there. You could move the existing band shell. You could repair it. You could turn it in a completely different direction. You could replace every piece of wood on there, provided the finished product looks like what's down there now, at least as it is written currently.
Anyway, so there are possibilities that we might be able to do something there. I think John Hart was next.
Hello, and thank you for your time and thank you for all the work you've done on all this, the zoning for the flood hazard overlay district. And I guess I should start by saying, I'm John Cart. I'm a resident of that flood district. And have been doing my best to keep up with what you've been working on. I have one specific question, but first I'll just say, I mean, I really support all the efforts you've done to try and make this, the regulations specific to Richmond's needs. I get that FEMA regulations may be, have fewer requirements than Richmond does, but FEMA's regulations have to apply nationwide in 1,000,001 situations that are irrelevant to Richmond. And does that, I don't think that means Richmond has to be more restrictive, but I think it certainly should be attentive to Richmond's specific needs and what we're experiencing and what we can anticipate. So again, I don't know another way to do it. So I appreciate the way you've worked on this, the way you've made the amendments to the district. So my specific question, I think it's a pretty clear answer already, but I just want to double check because I'm one of, I know a number of people who have told at least some of you and the Three Parks Committee that I believe that a paved path in the lower area of Volunteers Green, whether it's actual blacktop or crushed stone or SurePack, will exacerbate erosion in the area. And while it may be more accessible for a little while after the first big flood, it will be yet another big cost factor for the town to address. So I guess my question regards 4.7.4. The last phrase, provided that the structure's degree of nonconformity is not increased. So I'm thinking about the path along the river at Volunteers Green, which is, slowly being eroded and undercut, and will eventually need to be moved inland in segments. When that happens, does 4.7.4 mean that dirt path can't be replaced by something with SurePack or crushed stone or anything like that?
So, well, first of all, John, we've taken any ability of section 4.7 to be applicable to anything in the flood hazard area. So 4.7.4 doesn't apply. All of the regulations about non-conforming structures and uses are now contained within the flood hazard overlay district. We've removed 4.7.4 and 4.7 and 4.8. We've taken that out of the picture so that the whole, anything related to the flood hazard overlay district that relates to nonconformities, this is to not involve the rest of the document in this work that we're doing that is specific to the flood hazard overlay district. So you go to the flood hazard overlay district nonconformity section, which is 6.8.15, I think. So that is what is going to define what can happen with any non-conforming structure, like all the structures that are currently there now, are going to be looked at in section 6.8.15. So the path by the river is a pre-existing structure. So the way that it's written now,
It's a footpath? It's not a structure.
it's a footpath, it's not a structure. You can put it wherever you want if there are no bridges or if it's not paved, if it's not gravel. Are you interested in being able to replace that with a structure, or you're not interested? You're interested in it not being able to replace with a structure?
My concern is from the experience we've seen over the last several floods is that the river rips up the paved parking lot, the heavily packed access road with ease. A sure pack or paved path closer to the river will be a vector for increased erosion throughout its length. Path may stay, but all the soil around it will be ripped away.
So in the current proposal, we
Mhm.
are not proposing that that be allowed to be
Yeah.
replaced with a paved
Got it.
path.
I got you. So I'm sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that that was the case, and I
Right.
was clearly reading the wrong section.
It could be replaced with another footpath, with a natural path.
Well, as it's written in here in the definition section of this, there's a recreational path definition that was added, which would apply to the district at all of the zoning regulations, not just the flood hazard. That's on page 32 of the document that was posted by the planning commission. It's the last page.
Mhm.
I'll just read it quickly. Recreation path, a non-paved path of 4 feet or less in the width that is designated for pedestrian use and has been improved only by the removal of vegetation. It may also be called a footpath. A paved or gravel pathway shall be considered an on-ground improvement, which is its own thing. And the FHOD, on-ground improvements with the exception of parking areas, driveways, shall be considered structures. So if it's paved, it's a structure. If it's not paved, it's not a structure. And one thing is, I do think there's something that might need to change a little bit, because in 4.8 notes that the non-conforming uses are moved. It doesn't say that, nothing in 4.7 says that it doesn't necessarily apply, but when you get to 6.8.15, it notes structures and uses. So you might just want to make that
Well,
clear.
4.7 says this is not to apply to the flood hazard overlay, and 4.8.
It's the last sentence.
Okay, yep,
So
Sorry,
that's
didn't
in
see that
both
part.
4.7 and 4.8.
that was it. I noted it one time, not another time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I greatly appreciate it. If I could just throw in one more thing.
Oh.
Currently, I'd say, in my view, clearly limited perspective, a structure versus a band shell versus a pavilion. I could see with improvements in material science that a structure could be created with walls that can be rolled down for the few days a year when there's music played, and rolled up and out of flood hazard way in the future. Might not be the definition of band shell, but it would be safer and cheaper for everyone in the long run.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kara's up.
Kara.
Thank you, John. I agree with that point. That is actually on my list of points to make. So I agree with you about the relevance to Richmond about these regulations. I agree with you about the structure, that you could have temporary sound coming down in a pavilion format to do for the band shell purposes. I think my biggest concern is that these regulations did not do what the select board asked the planning commission to do, but rather became more restrictive. Because when you talk about relocate or reduce the size of existing uses or existing structures, that is not what the intent was. I think nowhere in this did it address the fact that the goal was to mitigate the risk. Meaning, if you took out the walls of a structure, like the bathrooms, and you relocated it to a larger pavilion, combining the band shell and the bathroom area with some bathrooms up there, that you are mitigating risk, and you're reducing if the engineers say we're removing these walls and putting these posts up, that the goal is to mitigate risk and allow flow through waters. And nowhere in your regulations does it address that you can go bigger with the size of a structure if there's no walls other than for 2 bathrooms, and you got rid of a concession stand that could then have a temporary concession stand set up within a pavilion. So your regulations was an attempt, but I don't think it addressed what the select board asked you to do, because you can either replace or reduce something, or you can only do the existing use. And that doesn't help with what, like Fran was saying, different sports, temporary structures. It's restricting, and Tyler is interpreting it as such how you've written it. So thank you for Tyler for pointing that out, that these regulations are more restrictive. And thank you to John for pointing out that we can have temporary walls come down. My concern is that we're waiting now for the next Three Parks public meeting to get public feedback, when we have been getting public feedback on this area for over a year and a half. So we shouldn't wait for just the next meeting. Mark has had comments that have not been listened to. I've had comments that have been not listened to. Tyler is not being listened to, with the fact that he's saying that the regulations become more restrictive based on how he's reading them.
All right, anybody else want to weigh in here?
Yeah.
Ian?
Just following up on what Kara said, both Kara and Mark have made comments that they're not being listened to. Like, can you guys, this is a hearing, so can you express exactly what it is that you're not getting?
Do you want to go first, Mark? I mean, I think I was just cut off by Chris Garando when I was trying to explain, and maybe I rambled a little bit. I apologize for rambling, but it is clear. You have an easy thing to do. If you go back and watch the state of Vermont individual who said you could clearly put in here, you could name this a municipal park, and then you could exempt certain things in the municipal park, such as long as it was mitigating flood risk, you could replace, remove, put back in structures that have a broader use, a more multi-purpose use that mitigate flood risk by removing some of the walls that you already have. That bathroom has flooded. We have spent tens of thousands of dollars cleaning it every time it floods. If you bring that bathroom up to the plateau, you are mitigating flood risk. You are reducing the cost to the taxpayer to have to clean and maintain and rebuild anytime floodwaters damage that area. Same with the playground.
So that is allowed, by the way, Kara, the movement of the bathroom and the reconstruction, rebuilding.
No,
up to the
you
plateau,
have
that is allowed.
only for the same use and size. You are not taking into account removal of walls to allow for a bigger structure, to allow for more people inside it as a pavilion, combining it with the band shell. The way you've written it, it has to stay band shell and it has to stay bathroom and concession stand. They may not be combined. Look at Tyler shake his head. That is how he interprets it. And this all matters how he interprets it, not how you interpret it.
Can we get rid of the concession stand? We can reduce it in size.
You can reduce it in size, but if it's a bathroom and concession stand, I mean, you can maybe not use the bath, but it would have to be a bathroom and it would have to look more or less like it does today. You could replace every single brick on it, but that configuration, and I don't know the exact configuration. If it's a 10 by 10, it's a 10 by 10 that you move up there, and that's what it is.
Or less.
More or less. That's what you get.
And that's
You don't get to take
my
it and bolt it
problem.
onto the band shell or to anything else, because again, none of that should be down there in the first place. It's all non-conforming.
We're not arguing about that. Tyler, we're not arguing about that. But my
No,
point is the
I'm
way
just
this is
explaining
written.
why it is that. That's why I'm explaining why I'm getting to that interpretation, is because none of that should be there. Therefore, if you're moving it, it has to be you're picking up the same thing and taking it and plopping it down somewhere else, but you don't get to turn it into a petting zoo or some other thing. Like that's what it is.
Tyler, no, let's not be silly. I don't want to be silly here. Ian asked me what specifically I had an issue with, and I'm trying to be clear. So I'm not trying to joke around. if
No, I'm
what
not
the
either.
goal was,
Just
if the
plenty
goal
of-
was to have a bigger pavilion that you could use with picnic tables, you could have multi-use purposes, just like all the other parks have. You have bathrooms in it. You can have performances in there if you make it big enough to allow for, like John said, the rolling down for the music purposes to keep the sound in the direction you want it in. The way it is written does not allow for a planning of anything, including you have an issue with, if we move the playground, the fencing around it. It's not going to
Okay.
happen.
So this is the public hearing that is to take the input like what you're providing, Kara. So, you know, we're listening to the input that is being provided.
Thank
This
you.
is the
I thank you.
opportunity that you have
Thank
to,
you. I appreciate that. I truly
Yeah.
do, Virginia. Thank you. I appreciate that. We've had other public meetings and discussions. That's what I was talking to, Ian. I did not feel heard. Thank you.
all right, thanks, Kara. Bard, I think.
Just a sort of general comment. I've gone back and forth between what our limiting factors are or sort of guardrails. And I had started to think it was about the footprint. And so I'm wrestling with, does it have to be called exactly the same thing and look the same, which seems a little further and more restrictive. So, and here's my example. If we move the playground, I'm going to guess it's not going to be exactly the same equipment or exactly newer versions of exactly the same equipment in a new place. There's probably going to be some parameters around the footprint of the equipment, and you can't exceed that. It would seem to me that logic would apply to things like the band shell and concession stand bathroom, that perhaps the footprint on the floodplain or floodway is more relevant than what we call it. And I'm not going to argue for or against the current band shell or something else, but I'll say, what year, remind me, was the band shell built?
76, 78.
So for those of us who attended live music in 1976, more or less, and have attended live music this year, there are substantial differences in things like portable speakers. There was a time where for generations, for thousands of years, you really had to pay attention to acoustics, and we may want to do that. My only point is that musical performances are perhaps no longer dependent on the acoustical properties of the building as they once were. And I'm just looking for the logic of, you know, if we're going to talk about the footprint, that maybe the footprint is more important as public use, public recreational facilities, than do we call it a band shell? Do we call it a bathroom? How big can the bathroom be? And I don't know if that's logical or not. It's just sort of what I'm gravitating to. And I'll give you an example from Burlington zoning, which had to do with lot coverage in a building that my family owned, a property that my family owned, where we could not cover more of the space on the lot because we'd already exceeded it, but you could trade it. So literally you could take away a shed and replace that shed with a deck. And that was an example of the logic in Burlington at that time. It was really about the coverage, not about what we called it or what they called it. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
We do want the bathrooms to have walls, however. When you talk about structures without walls, including the bathroom, I'm thinking, nobody's gonna like those bathrooms without walls.
Mark's up next. We should
Yeah,
have.
but they can be designed to be handicapped accessible, single-use bathrooms, unisex, so you have a person at a time and two bathrooms up there, to do away with the bathrooms that aren't fully functioning the way they are and are not handicap accessible. So I'm not joking about accessibility either.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Mark?
Thank you. Just very, very quickly to Ian's point, about not really being heard, is I was trying to be cut off earlier when I was trying to make a point before I got to the gist of it and threw my head in a tizzy, and I don't think I really got to the points that I wanted to encompass because I was cut off and told that we need to give other people time, even though everybody else gets plenty of time uninterrupted, except Kara and I guess opposing voices to what you have. I tried to attend the walk around meeting where I was intentionally cut out of. We've had very limited conversations regarding this zoning district. Basically, this zoning was rewritten and then with basically the essence of what it is right now, and then presented to us. And then we had 2 partial meetings to basically sanction what was given to us without full, and this is on for your benefit too, is you weren't really presented with the full scope of the possibilities and the things that we could do with this district. It was never brought up. It was not addressed. I spent maybe 5 minutes talking with Kyle Madash, and he has on board and interpreted that the FEMA regulations are completely within the bounds of all of the crazy stuff we put out there. I'm not saying we want a walkway, a paved road, or all of these other things. But Kyle, in last month, before this meeting, I wanted to talk to him before we did the walkabout, which I was never included on, but I did talk to him, and he explained to me that pretty much everything that's been bounced around is totally within the bounds of FEMA zoning regulations and acceptable, and in many cases improvements on what we have now. But those discussions weren't allowed to take place among the committee because we were given a predefined summation of these are the changes that we're going to propose. You either take these or not. They didn't propose any of the other options that were out there. We were given exactly what I think leadership believes was appropriate. They've made the decision that this is what is appropriate for the town, and therefore we're only presenting these concepts to the Planning Commission for discussion and to the town on a broader scale. And yes, I have an issue with that. I think it's poor leadership to exclude other people's perspectives before the discussion is even made. So that's that.
So,
And
what kind-
just to be clear about, and you brought up the great example of the bathrooms. Those bathrooms, and Kyle explained this to me in 5 minutes, and why it never came up in any of, evidently, Richmond personnel have had multiple conversations with Kyle, and he's talked to them about that. Even why it never came up to the Planning Commission, I don't know. But Kyle's point is that what we need to do is, to a degree, mitigate the issues that we have. We've got a solid bathroom and concession stand that isn't ADA, it isn't anything else. It's a solid brick wall building with no flow through, whatever. There's tons of engineering compatible with floodplains and floodways that allows flow through of water. You could build a structure 5 times bigger than the concession stand and still have less impact on floodwater movement if constructed correctly. Those options were never put on the table. They were never brought up. They've been interpreted as, okay, you want a bathroom, you want to move it, fine. It has to be square. It has to be the same size. It has to have all the identical or smaller of what it is. And that's the only thing we were told. That is not true. The hazard regulations allow a lot more flexibility than that. We could build a brand new bathroom up top of the plateau, ADA accessible, with ramps and the necessary accoutrements to enable the handicapped folks to actually get up to the plateau which right now under our current zoning regulations is not allowed, and under our proposed regulations is not allowed. We could build all of that and totally rebuild the concession stand, or maybe reduce it to a smaller building with flow through, and have less impact on floodway waters than we do now. But those options are never presented to anyone. I had to go dig them out on my own. That's not my responsibility. I'm just a flunky. These sort of things should be talked about among the town administration and chairmanship, and these types of thoughts and possibilities should be brought forward to the full commission. That's what has me in a bind, and I feel like I'm ranting, and I am ranting, but I am that angry about it. I'm very, very frustrated and disappointed and concerned about the steerage of this committee, which is why I think we need to get it out, this discussion in particular, out of this committee and into a more reasonably minded leadership.
So what we're gonna do, Mark, is we're gonna take the material that we've got today, the outreach work that has been done, and we're gonna talk about it on the planning commission before we send something to the select board. That's the way that the process.
I would argue that we as a commission, and I'll propose it at some point, that we approve the regulations as is and send them to somebody else who's going to take a critical review of them and then tell you, fix it. Because I don't think there is a willingness to fix it among the administration and leadership of the planning commission. I think you want to do as very little as possible because you feel as very little as possible should be done. That's not what the democratic process is.
Yeah,
Should
and
be
you-
left open to the people and to a broader scope of people than 2 or 3 people making decisions and
We-
coming forward and saying, this is what we're going to do. So no,
We've
I
got
don't think we
outreach.
can
We're
talk
gonna
about
take
it
it,
realistically
talk
and
about it.
have a representative discussion of the possibilities. Because I
Yeah,
think
well, we're not gonna vote to forward it to the select board until we have our planning commission discussion about it.
Wasn't this the hearing? I mean, in normal circumstances, when we have the hearing, we hold the hearing, we say, okay, do we want to tweak a little thing? Let's send it to the select board in the same night. That's what we do. That's what we always do. Now, all of a sudden, you're like, oh, wait, this is a hearing where we would normally just forward it on because we've done our due diligence. And you want to take it back and slow roll it again to the point where we don't have any options and choices, because we're not going to address this topic with the same degree of responsibility that this topic deserves. And I'm confident of that. You can try and do that, and maybe the vote will go against me and it'll stay in the planning commission, but it's just going to linger. And it's not going to be inclusive or democratic participation in the decision-making process. That's me.
Yep, that's a rant. I would call that a rant. Anybody else want to make a comment? Kendra. Microphone.
Another one, that's 2.
Kendra Ziski, and so I just want to make sure I get my feedback in.
Yes.
I think I'm close enough.
Neither
tonight.
one should be.
Yeah. So the first thing I just want to mention is with the playground and the interpretation that's kind of come out of this compared to when we first started talking to Tyler about this, and that we're now measuring the exact size and this kind of thing. And when we first started talking, it was the wood chip structure concept. And so I just want to put it out there that this has gotten more stringent under current understanding of it. Whether that's actually based on the wording or whether that's based on interpretations changing, I have no way of knowing that, but that's just from what we've started with to where we're at right now.
Can I just make a comment about
Sure.
that really quickly? So the playground structure measurements are the measurements of the structures. It's not more restrictive because they can be placed anywhere with the wood chips surrounding it. This is what his explanation was at the playground visit.
Well,
So-
I'd be happy to just state that. So basically, how this whole came about, and this is kind of a case study in why I don't entertain hypotheticals or really don't like to because you know, the devil so often in zoning is the details, right? So which is why I try very hard to avoid having hypothetical conversation. So, and I do recall that conversation initially when we thought about that was with the wood chips. Now, the issue becomes with doing it that way is because again, getting back to, it's like, well, why am I, you know, the difference between the playground structures and let's say the band shell or the bathroom concession stand, right? The issue is that those are kind of, how should we say, more clearly defined, like it's easy to replicate those things. It's not easy to replicate playground equipment. So if I use the same methodology, which in theory, I probably should for 8.1, but I'm trying to kind of be a little bit reasonable and make it actually easier, and it might not feel that way, make it easier for the Three Parks Committee is that if I was to hold the same standard in the band shell in the bathroom, I would say, okay, you get a 1-to-1, meaning that you take that existing playground as it is configured, pick it up, move it, drop it down there. Now, granted, you could get brand new equipment provided it looks like exactly like what's there. And I realize when you look at that, the feasibility of that happening is probably not very realistic, given the age of that. So then that leaves me with the conundrum of how do I let you, because you are allowed to repair and maintain existing non-conforming structures. How do I let you upgrade this stuff while also still complying to the regulations where you can't expand it or make it bigger? Which led me to the box idea. So when I had initially thought about it, it's like, okay, I'll take the whole playground area, chips and all, draw a box around it. The problem was with that is what I was doing unintentionally, and I realized that after thinking more about it is if I let you put, and I was gonna let you put more or less whatever you can fit in that box, you could fit in that box. If you could chock-a-block it full, I don't care, but that's the box that you get. The problem is if I do that, the way I was originally intending to do it is it would have led to an expansion of the playground and expanding the flood hazard because all that wood chipped area doesn't necessarily have structures on it right now. Whereas if I say, okay, here's this box, you get to put whatever you want in it. In theory, it could lead you really expanding that playground. So what I did was took that idea and essentially shrunk it down. So what I did was I have a little measuring wheel that I use for like measuring driveways or distances. And I walked around kind of there's more or less, and forgive me, I'm trying to recall this off the top of my head. At least let's call it 4 or 5 areas that have playground equipment in it. There's a smaller one for toddlers. There's the main one. There's the swings, and I kind of went around that. Now I didn't go exactly around every single little piece because I had to get this to a point where I could measure it. Basically, I did is holding as tight as I could. I went around it and drew a series of boxes that said, okay, provided the equipment fits inside of these boxes, right? These 5 boxes, you can put as much as put as much as you want inside of that box. But that total square footage is what you get. Now, if you want to put 50 yards of wood chips in between that structure and another structure up there, that's fine. What I don't want you to do is to take that whole area. The next thing you know, your playground equipment that goes from, let's call it 2,000 square feet to 6,000 square feet, right? That's what I'm trying to avoid. So, and again, I apologize if my initial interpretation led to confusion on that point.
And to be clear, my point was not to say you're now changing your tune and we're mad about, like.
No,
my
I understand. I'm
point
just
is-
trying to clarify.
I want to be clear on my point. My point is not to put Tyler on trial here and say that he said something and now he's changing his mind. My point is to say that we're here to hear a public hearing on what we're kind of asking to do. And Tyler's having to interpret this as it's been said. And so we can only use your drafted words and what Tyler is then saying and understand that this is becoming quite stringent in measuring this. And we are not trying to in any way massively expand this playground. But it becomes very hard for a playground designer to design something that needs to fit in a very, like, Tyler's explaining that he literally measured the exact parameters, and so you get this piece, and that
Actually
piece
gave
is
you a
this
little bit.
big, and this big. But
In most cases.
you're understand, like, that is very difficult, and so we're not asking to make this massive new playground. What we're asking to be able to do is reasonably design a playground that if one were to look at it, they would say that's probably the same size. You know, that's really what we're asking to do.
Yeah,
So
and you can do that under the proposed regulations.
Is that accurate, Tyler?
I mean, I would say yes. Again, you are like, and I not, we're trying to talk in circles. So again, you get, which I gave you, which I think was, I think off the top of my head, like 2,000 or so square feet, give or take. I'm trying to remember exactly off the top of my head with that memo. I know there was a question of a sandbox or sand area that was there that wasn't there. Be more than happy to, if somebody could say, hey, it was Pete or whoever could say, hey, it was 10 by 12, great, I'll give you that as well. But
But you
whatever
can,
this,
and you can make it as large as you want with the wood chips. It's the structures that
Well, then
are
we get into the fence
concerning.
is the second piece.
Right.
The
The
fence
fence
we
is
gotta-
a
we gotta
different, the
work on
fence
that.
is a
You've heard
different
it, so I'm
piece.
not gonna repeat.
Yeah, but
I agree
the
with
thing
that.
about the structures is that you can place as many wood chips between them, around them, you know. FEMA and the floodplain doesn't care about the wood chips, there's the expense, but that's another thing.
and I would let you put
So,
little fences around that, provided it fits in that box. Granted, from a practical standpoint, that may not make the
Can't
most
work.
sense, but I'm
Yeah.
just trying to,
Inside box?
I'm just trying to be like
Okay, that I.
generous as I can be
My
with it
next
within
point,
reason.
we heard, I don't wanna, so. I
so
wanna
you're
just-
okay with that point, though? My point has
abandoning
been
your
heard.
first.
No,
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 no.
no. My point has been heard. I don't need
Okay,
to circle around. I'm trying
Okay.
to be brief with my points. You've heard my point. You can take my feedback or not take my feedback on whether that works or not, period. My second point is, I agree with this concept of the band shell and what we define it as being a little convoluted, and I just want to second what John and Kara were saying. I agree. You've heard that point.
Mhm.
And then I just want to be clear that the whole ask of this is to create a parameter that Tyler can interpret this reasonably in reducing the flood mitigation, but allowing us to create something that actually functions. And I just want you to be hearing the feedback that you're hearing, and you guys will do with it as you may, and we will be trying to make a good plan.
And what is your vision of functions exactly? To
Well, I
make
think that
something
you're defining the band shell as simply music, and I think that its use is broader than that, and its use was. I wasn't here when it was originally
Mm.
there,
Mhm.
but I'm sure that they only didn't use it for music at any given time. I'm sure somebody at some point sat on it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So this is
So I
mostly
think
about
that-
the band
Drank
shell.
beer.
It's mostly about the
something
band
of the
shell
design.
that you're talking about, the functional.
Because
Functionality of-
you define, like it was already said, the band shell is very defined in your current wording as being a band shell, and just being able to broaden the use of what that isn't, being currently used for and likely at some point was used for.
Okay, great.
And just to be clear on that point, if somebody, I know even if I'm saying it as what it is, it's a band shell. If somebody went up and started playing checkers in there or doing something, I'm not gonna go up and say, no, this is just a band shell. You can't use that. So it could be, I'm not gonna go up and police exactly what's going on there and be like, oh, is this fall into the jurisdiction of music or not? I'm more less concerned about the shape as it is, of the shape of the structure, what you use it for inside. I'm agnostic on. It's just that it's like, unless this says that you can reconfigure it massively, like, which I don't think it does as of right now, it means you get to take this, rebuild it brand new. It's got to look more or less like it is right there with the pitch of the roof and everything. Take it and move it. You can, what you do with it after it's there is not my
But like
concern.
I said, it
I
may
think-
be that we can,
Right, and that's what I'm
change the
asking, is
definition.
I understand you're having to interpret what's in front of you, and that's all I'm trying to say, is this is how it's being interpreted, and that's not quite the intent. And if we could use the same approach with, we're talking about the playground, it's not gonna look the exact same, it's gonna look like a playground. So if we can broaden what the concept of this other structure is as well, then it gives us more opportunities to potentially create a more resilient building.
okay.
Just add to what Kendra was saying about the current band shell, but it's like
Didn't
a,
even come up, didn't it?
I'm sorry. Denise Barnard, it's like a, maybe identified as like a multi-use facility, I mean, not a facility, because I mean, the town rents it out for birthday parties. Seniors have said to us, they'd love to go have a place to have a picnic with some sun, some shade, so that they don't get sun exposure. You know, they do family reunions there. They, the farmer's market people use it when it starts raining. They hover under it, and I don't know if it's their
And
clients.
music.
Yeah, and the music, and it's used for music, so it's not only used for music, and there's dance performances there, I don't know if you know that. But people have dance performances there,
Mhm.
so there's many uses that, you know, it's used for now. And I think we could just expand on it and make it a outdoor space for
Right.
the town of
Instead of
Richmond.
just pigeonholing it. So
Exactly.
Bard,
So, not to pile on, but this is what I've been contemplating. I would ask that the planning commission discuss and consider more generic language about the buildings in the band shell, bathroom and concession stand inclusively. I think it's a mistake to tie our hands and say, like, the concession stand and the band shell, you can move them, but they have to look exactly the same. I think the key elements are likely footprints, not making the problem that we have worse, but making it better. So if we move everything up there, yeah, it would appear to me, based on conversation and the available evidence, that it makes risk lower. And I would encourage you, just like the discussion of soccer goals and other athletic equipment, to think perhaps a bit more generically about the current structures and the names, and think, just like the playground, as more footprint and buildings for public use, recreational, musical, aesthetic, artistic, etc. And by that, I don't mean to suggest we should tear down the bandstand tomorrow or the band shell. But in some future state, it would seem to me that we might choose to replace the existing buildings with a single building that had multiple uses and was more appropriate and flexible for a variety of uses. And you don't have to react. I just encourage the planning commission to contemplate and discuss that.
thank you, Bard. Mark, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Kendra, thanks for those great points. And to build on that, to be clear, yes, Tyler, this isn't intended to be a pile on for your interpretations and saying you're wrong in interpreting that. The problem is in that the regulations don't give you the proper guidance that I think is intended, and their limitations. But when you talk about moving the playground in the same sense that you could improve the concession stand room and build another bathroom and still have less of an impact on floodwaters than what is currently being done, the same thing could be said about the playground. That playground is right in the narrowest, fastest moving, deepest part of the entire floodway. Taking that size playground, raising it 10 feet up, taking it almost completely out of the flow of that water. If you were to quadruple the size of that playground, you would still have less impact on floodwaters than the system is here. But you can't do that. You're not allowed to interpret it in that manner, because our zoning regulations, the way they are written, do not come anywhere close to providing that kind of flexibility. My point is that to rework that language for the entire flood hazard overlay district in Richmond could open so many doors that we don't want to open, that it is a failed process to try and accommodate everything that we would like to see and would be reasonable in the floodplain, and apply that to the entire rest of the town's flood hazard overlay district. My argument has been from the get-go, from last winter when we had the roundtable, that the most practical option is to carve out a town-defined, town-governed flood hazard overlay district of the park. And then allow the flexibility there, because nobody's going to build that without having to go through the ringer of what Bob and many other people have expressed as excessive construction in the floodway. And they're going to be opposed to that. The select board isn't going to be able to just run amok and build 10 times a building and not having any accounting for it, or doing any of these other expansions. It's not going to happen if it is a town designated, town responsible district. So I'm really trying to make that point with folks, and I'm hoping it might begin to sink in.
Okay, anybody else? Kara?
Just to comment on Bart's comment, Bart, I agree with you about your issue about the footprint. I just want you to note, though, it's not just specific about footprint. It could be, the language could be written that it's either footprint or an engineered calculated mitigation replacement. Because if you're taking out walls, you're removing walls, the mitigation of that means you might be able to have a larger footprint if it only has posts to support above a roof, to have an area for seniors to be in the shade and people to be in the shade. So I think footprint is not the only term that can be used. It can be used as one part of it, and it could say footprint or engineered calculated calculations of mitigation. Does that make, I don't know exactly how that wording goes. Please realize I'm not trying to drill down that specific wording to you, but it's the concept. The concept is the footprint. I agree with you, Bard, but the footprint isn't the only calculation that goes into place here. And that would be key for what Mark is saying about the floodway with the playground, moving it to a higher elevation is mitigating risk. And maybe you can have a small percentage of an increase based on the design that the playground people come up with, not going massively, but a small, like 5% increase to accommodate the new design. And you've mitigated, 30% of your risk by moving it up, or 40% of your risk by moving it up. So that minor 5% increase would be reasonable. Or the minor increase of putting a fence to prevent kids from running into the road, the mitigation of risk by moving it out of the fast-paced area of the floodway to a higher elevation. There's an engineering calculation there that they do, and that's key. That's the data proves the facts.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to weigh in at this point? Okay, so commissioners, nobody else. Oh, Erin looks like she wants to weigh in. Erin.
I have a tiny little thing and it's totally different, but we definitely have flooding issues. But we've also, thanks to climate change, have had some microburst things happening. And I'm just thinking about those soccer goals that are on wheels, and they're not really, it sounds like they're not tethered to the ground. And they should be, because if it's able to just be moved by the wind or something, then it's going to be damaging could be damaging to neighboring cars or windows of the houses or whatever. And anyway, small thing, but could we make sure we don't have things that could blow around? Thanks. Because I actually had a trampoline in my backyard that blew around and thankfully did not hit my house, but it could have done significant damage. So wind moves things that you don't think it will.
Okay. All right, great. So I think what we're looking for now from a commissioner is either a motion to close the public hearing or to continue the public hearing to a future date. If we close the public hearing, people are still welcome to come and listen to our discussion, because we'll be discussing the information that we've heard at probably our next meeting. If we continue it, then we're leaving it open for more.
I move to close the public discussion.
Okay, the public hearing.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
Okay, so Mark moved to close it. Okay, any more discussion about the motion to close the public hearing? Hearing none, all in favor should say aye.
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 Chris, that was an aye. Allison?
Allison is here.
Okay, Allison, do you want to weigh in on this vote? You're muted. Okay, well, we have heard from 4 of us, so
That's a quorum.
motion passes. So we will close the public hearing. Take the information, look at it in the form of, what we want to do with these regulations. And we can also look at the lawyer's comments. So we submitted it for legal review to our town attorney. He didn't have a lot to say really about it. But we can look at his comments and then make a final decision about what we wish to approve to send to the select board. All right, so thank you all for coming. And
Thanks for what you do. Thanks.
yeah, it's harder than you might think to write regulations, I have to tell you, to make them consistent with everything that they need to be consistent with. So anyway, great. We'll probably have a discussion at our November meeting, our first November meeting. We have some other things also to discuss, but yeah, try to.
I'm just
Yeah, go
gonna
ahead.
put it out there. I'd like to make a motion that we approve the zoning regulations as they've been written and forward them to the select board for further discussion. I think that's our only likely way to have significant progress in moving these regulations forward in a reasonable manner.
Okay, so Mark's motion is on the table. Is there a second?
Had to do it.
So there's no second, so the motion fails. And we will continue with the discussion of it. And Mark, you're welcome to contribute to the discussion and make the persuasive arguments.
I hope I'm allowed to.
So, yep, anytime. All right, so I think we're good. We'll move on to item number 6. That's the end of the public hearing. Keith, any updates?
No.
Or other business?
Not that I have. Nope.
No updates or other business. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting.
No, I have a question that I wanted to ask before we adjourn.
Okay, go ahead.
Last week, I believe you presented to the select board on proposals relating to Jolena Court, and I was wondering if you could describe that reaction from the select board, and also just what is our schedule for re-engaging on that topic and resolving that?
So Chris, so that was about the VRNs. Not the Jolena Court, not Jolena Court.
Well, it also, I guess, to put it more specifically, discussed proposals for density bonuses, which would be relevant to Jolena Court.
Did we talk about density bonuses at the select board meeting?
There was, yeah, not density bonuses, no, just.
Talked about the density, the question of density.
Yeah, not about the bonuses.
In Act 181. Okay, so we talked about the village residential neighborhoods, which we had approved and forwarded for the select board approval. Okay. Since we submitted that material and approved it, we have had guidance on Act 181, which was passed in 2024, subsequent to Act 47 that was passed in 2023. That said, in essence, any place you can put a single family home, you can put also a duplex and a 3 to 4 unit multifamily building. So that was not in our VRN's proposal because it was, you know, the duplex was in there, and the fact that you could have a 3 to 4 multifamily building was in there, but you had to abide by the density in that district, which we established as per Act 47 to be 5 units per acre. So the select board directed us to take them and put in the new guidance on Act 181, which is to allow the duplex or the 3 to 4 multifamily to be put anywhere where a single family home could be placed. So that is what we need to do, and we will take that up at our next planning commission meeting, along with this material, to try to, you know, there's virtually nothing that we can do about it. But it is going to cause a lot of consternation. Because with a density of 5 units per acre, you can have a lot of 0.2 acres. If you put a 3 to 4 unit building on every one of those 0.2 acre lots, you would have a density of 20 units per acre. But that is the law right now. That's the way the law is stated. That's the way the zoning department has to interpret it. No matter what our zoning regulations say, they have to follow the state law. So until that is changed by the legislature, that is what we've got, and that is what we have to put into the VRNs. But we'll talk about it, and, you know, the commissioners can weigh in and the public can weigh in, for that matter. You know, anybody can weigh in on it, but we don't really see that we can do anything else except put it into the zoning. You could leave it out of our zoning, but it's still going to be administrated by the zoning department as per state regulations. So.
And schedule then, I think was the second question, the schedule.
Yeah, so does that answer your question about what happened?
No, I was more asking the schedule question, but thank you. That's useful.
So the schedule question. So we have 3 things that we have to work on. We have to try to finalize the flood hazard overlay district with the information that we have, working on the draft, which we're going to try to do on the 2nd of November. We have to talk about at least adding the density language into the VRN. There's not a whole lot of discussion that is going to be meaningful about that, I think, because our hands are tied. But anyway, we need to talk about that. So we'll hopefully have some time to do that on our meeting. And then the third thing is to finish the density bonus section for Jolena Court so that we can approve that and finalize it and send it to the select board.
Yep.
So that's the schedule for our next 2 meetings, 3 meetings, depending on how long we want to take on any of these things. And commissioners, any work you want to do on this and make your persuasive arguments one way or the other, go right ahead. Because they're all difficult problems to work on. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes, it does. And I think, like all commissioners, you know, I come to the meeting to do that work and look for opportunities to be able to do that in the context of the meeting. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, we seem to be progressing on the Jolena Court issue. We have a plan. We need to finalize the details of the density bonus program. So, which are relatively complicated.
They're in the works.
But they're in the works. We will have to decide if we want to have a December 18th meeting. At some point, we'll talk about that, I guess, at our next meeting, if we want to have a December 18th meeting. Hopefully, we've got a lot of work to do, so.
Yeah. Well, and I would like to move that we adjourn.
Okay, I think,
Kara's
so
got
Kara's got a question. Maybe we can answer her question if it's brief, hopefully, before we adjourn.
Thank you, Virginia. My question just has to do with the Jolena Court. And if you're making changes to the regulations for Jolena Court or the density and things like that, has anything been discussed? I know they've got their next building has been approved, but if you make density changes, they'll come back before the DRB. Is there anything that's discussed or any plans for the changes to the intersection of Jolena Court with Bridge Street and dealing with increased traffic and what that's going to mean to that intersection? Or is that going to be solely the responsibility of the taxpayers rather than the developer to deal with that intersection?
Well, we're having a study of the intersection, right?
At some point, yep.
At some point.
But I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said, Virginia. I apologize.
At some point, there will be a study that is going to be done about the intersection, because the intersection has many factors besides Jolena Court. It's got Railroad Street.
Oh, yeah. No, yeah, I'm totally aware of all the factors. I was just asking is it going to ever, when is it determined whose burden that is? If the developer will pay any of the costs for any infrastructure upgrade to that intersection?
I would say, Kara, probably not in the towns right away, but certainly leading up to it. I think, as you know, that intersection is a commercial intersection that is undersized at this point. So that is a big part of that study. And I know that Mark has been vocal on that issue also, and we have had some discussion on that. I'll be frank with you. I have not moved that forward. That's something I'll have to get approval from the select board to do, but I do have it within my budget to go ahead and procure an engineer for that. So
and I didn't know Mark had discussed this at all. I apologize for not knowing that. I just know if you're going to change regulations and I know we want housing, do not get me wrong.
Yep.
I know if you're going to change regulations to give bonuses for increased density, then it shouldn't also be allowing the developer to make all kinds of money while the taxpayer has the burden of paying for the infrastructure upgrade of the intersection. You could put in somewhere that they have to pay a proportional cost for the infrastructure upgrade.
I would like to ask that we defer further discussion of this until it's an item on the agenda.
I'm just asking if it can be, is all.
It is. You've heard that it is going to be an item on the agenda.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I did not hear. Virginia broke up for me. I apologize.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a motion on the table by Chris to adjourn. Is there a second?
I second it.
By Mark. Okay. Is there any one that has a problem with adjourning of the commissioners? If there is no feeling against adjourning, the meeting stands adjourned.
We got like 5 more hours to go until we hit 19 hours. Oh,
all right, we good?
let's see if I can break my record, 19 and a half hours.
Y'all.
Boy, yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.